My name is Alex, and let me be clear, I'm not into horror stories. It's not that they frighten me, I just find them a bit ridiculous. Before I moved to the city with my mom, I'd never been easily scared. I came from a rough neighborhood, where real dangers loomed, and people had real problems. But everything changed one Halloween night, more than a decade ago. After a successful night of trick-or-treating, my friends and I headed to a small fair that had set up in town. It wasn't anything grand, just a few old rides and a creaky Ferris wheel. But for a bunch of 10 and 11-year-olds in a small place, it was thrilling. The fair was aglow with lights, and the air was filled with the smell of cotton candy, fried food, and the sound of excited laughter, something we didn't experience often. Around 9 p.m., we decided to split up. Some friends stayed on the rides, while others headed home. I, however, decided to take a quiet stroll on my own. I'm not fond of crowds and felt like I needed a break from all the noise and people. As I wandered around the attractions, avoiding the bustling crowds, I spotted something unusual, a tent, tucked away behind the other booths. It had no sign, and the entrance was so dark it seemed to absorb all the light around it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached, feeling a strange pull towards it. The air grew colder as I neared the tent, as if it were disconnected from the liveliness around it. I looked around and saw no one else nearby, which felt eerie. But I went inside anyway. The tent's interior was larger than expected, filled with an oppressive silence that made it feel like another world entirely. Something felt wrong, I could sense it, but I couldn't turn back. Something pulled me towards the tent center, where I found a staircase leading down, a strange addition for a fairground tent. Following the stairs, I found myself in a long, dimly lit hallway, much like a subway tunnel. The air was thick, almost as if something unseen was trying to keep me from advancing, yet I felt compelled to go further, almost in a trance. Eventually, I reached a carved wooden door at the end, with a faint light spilling through a crack. Driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, I opened it. The door creaked as it swung open, revealing a steep, narrow staircase descending into darkness. The dim light barely illuminated the steps, and the rest of the space was swallowed by blackness. My stomach churned, sensing I shouldn't go further, yet an irresistible force in my mind urged me onward. I descended one step, then another, as silence pressed around me. My heartbeat was loud in the quiet, and I could barely breathe, but I couldn't stop. As I continued, I suddenly snapped back to reality, wondering why I was going down a dark staircase, alone, in a deserted part of the fair. Despite the unease, I kept descending, as if my mind and body weren't in sync. My friends were likely looking for me, I thought, and I shouted, but no answer came. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the sound of my feet. Then, I froze. Realization dawned that I had no idea how or why I ended up here, yet I couldn't shake the feeling I was under some spell. With determination, I tried to turn back, but my legs felt as heavy as lead, like something was anchoring me in place. I was about to force myself to leave when I heard footsteps behind me, slowly at first, but they quickly grew louder and faster, echoing through the stairwell. Though I couldn't see anything, I felt the presence of something coming at me with dreadful speed, bringing with it the chill of death itself. Suddenly, warm drops splattered onto my face, blood. I looked up, but the darkness obscured everything, save for the metallic taste of blood slipping into my mouth. The steps grew wet beneath me, making it hard to keep my balance. My fear transformed into sheer survival instinct, and my legs jolted into action, pushing me to run down the stairs, away from whatever pursued me. I slipped in the blood-soaked darkness as the relentless footsteps closed in. Then, a cold hand, skeletal and sharp, grasped my shoulder. I turned in terror, lost my footing, and tumbled down the steps, each impact bringing sharp pain. My limbs twisted unnaturally, and I screamed, but the sound felt trapped in the endless darkness. After what seemed like an eternity of falling, the pain faded, and everything went black. I awoke to the sunrise, lying in a ditch outside the fairgrounds, my body bruised, clothes stained with dried blood. I could barely move. A couple of kids found me, their faces pale as they called for help. Everything blurred, and when I opened my eyes again, I was in the hospital, cast and bandaged. My mom was beside me, exhausted, eyes swollen from crying. I tried to tell her what happened, but she just held my hand, murmuring that everything would be fine. Later, I overheard that the doctors thought I'd been hit by a car and left on the road. But I remembered no car. I recalled only the strange tent and that relentless staircase. After some healing, I convinced my friends to return with me to the fairgrounds. I wanted to prove to them, and maybe to myself, that what I'd experienced was real. But when we arrived, there was no tent, just grass and dirt, as if nothing had ever been there. My friends looked at me like I'd lost my mind. For a while it was frustrating, but eventually, I stopped talking about it. I couldn't explain what happened, and maybe I wasn't meant to. Yet I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't escaped. Had something decided to let me go, or was I simply lucky? I'll never know for sure. But I'm certain that if I had stayed on those stairs, something far worse than death awaited me. Can you imagine the terror of feeling a gun aimed at you and then hearing the sickening crack of a bullet tearing through bone? I felt that once, on Halloween night. But before that, I was just a kid like any other, candy-loving, costume-wearing, and completely into trick-or-treating. Halloween was my favorite day of the year. But you can tell I'm speaking in the past tense, right? Because everything changed that night, and Halloween would never feel the same again. Now, I'm 17, but the trauma of that one horrifying night still haunts me, with memories so intense I'll never forget them. The first thing I remember were Mike's words, "Aren't we too old for this?" He grumbled in his werewolf costume, giving me a shove as I nudged him back. Mike, my best friend at 12, had a particular dislike for Halloween. "Don't ruin it." "I can't trick-or-treat alone," I pleaded, holding up my half-filled candy bag. "We're 12, we only get a few more years of this before we're too old," I reminded him. We couldn't join Halloween parties like our older siblings, so this was as good as it got. We hit a few houses, filling our bags as we went. The neighborhood looked fantastic, pumpkins, creepy scarecrows, and spider webs everywhere. I felt great in my vampire costume, but Mike wasn't as thrilled. Then, as we rounded a corner, his expression shifted. "Hey, there's my dad," he shouted. Sure enough, there was Mr. Morgan, dressed as a pirate, complete with a hook, eye patch, and even a toy parrot on his shoulder. "Having fun, boys?" he asked, grinning. I showed off my candy haul proudly. "Great night, Mr. Morgan," I replied. Mike asked, "What are you doing here, Dad?" Mr. Morgan held up a small candy bag and explained, "I'm helping your little sister, Jenny. She can't walk this far yet, so I'm collecting candy for her." Then, Mike pointed to a house further down the street, one that was eerily dark and undecorated. My steps faltered, and an uneasy feeling washed over me. The yard was a mess, littered with broken glass and junk. I felt a chill crawl up my spine, and my heart began pounding faster. Suddenly, I thought I heard something, a strange, low whisper, almost like a voice rasping right next to me. I couldn't make out what it said, but it chilled me to my core. "Did you hear that?" I asked, barely able to speak. But Mike and his dad looked at me like I was imagining things. The whisper came again, a cold murmur that made the hair on my arms stand up. "Let's just go home," I said, feeling a growing sense of dread. But Mike only laughed, calling me a chicken as he headed toward the creepy house, with Mr. Morgan following. Reluctantly, I joined them, feeling my stomach twist. They knocked on the door, yelling, "Trick or treat," but silence answered. Then, without warning, bam! The door burst apart, splintering into pieces as bullets tore through the air. I hit the ground, hands covering my head, but it was too late. A bullet ripped through my left arm, and another struck my shoulder. The pain was sharp and blinding, and I screamed. The gunfire seemed to go on forever before finally stopping. The next thing I knew, a man stumbled out, holding a smoking gun, eyes wide with horror. I thought you were them," he muttered, his voice shaking. His gaze fell near my feet, and I turned to see something that shattered my heart. Mike was lying there, his eyes empty, a pool of blood spreading beneath him. He'd been hit in the chest and head, there was no question he was gone. Mr. Morgan's cry cut through the silence, a sound I'll never forget. He threw himself beside Mike, screaming for help, holding his lifeless son as if he could bring him back. Police and paramedics arrived quickly, and that's when I learned the man with the gun was a gang member, paranoid about a rival attack and mistaking us for his enemies. He was taken away, locked up for what he'd done, but none of that mattered. Mike was gone. The wounds on my body eventually healed, but the pain inside never left. Sometimes I wonder if it was my fault for convincing Mike to go out that night. And sometimes, I think about the voice I heard, was it a warning? Or was it death itself, taunting me before taking my best friend? I'll never know for sure, but one thing is clear, that was the last Halloween I ever celebrated. Now, whenever October 31st draws near, I feel a knot in my stomach as memories of that terrible night flood back, making me relive every detail. Halloween has become something I despise, and I think it always will be. Last year was my first time living alone after I rented a small house in a new neighborhood closer to my job. I moved in at the beginning of October, and while the area was quiet, the neighbors seemed to keep to themselves, so I decided to do the same. Everything was pretty uneventful for the first few weeks. As Halloween approached, I noticed that only a few houses had minimal decorations, mostly just pumpkins and a couple of signs, nothing elaborate. It didn't look like many people celebrated Halloween here, so I figured I'd only need one small bag of candy to hand out. Halloween evening arrived, and I only got a few small groups of kids. While I was a bit disappointed, I still enjoyed handing out treats. Halloween had always been fun for me, and I didn't want that feeling to fade. As it got late, around 10:30 p.m., I put the candy away in the pantry, settled on the couch, and started a scary movie to unwind. About 45 minutes into the movie, the doorbell rang. I was a little surprised and, honestly, a bit annoyed, who was still out trick-or-treating this late. But when I peeked through the peephole, I saw a young boy, maybe 9 or 10, standing at the door in an odd costume. It was a black outfit with fiery red details, and he wore a dark, expressionless mask. I opened the door, and he quietly said, "Trick or treat." It was almost 11 p.m., so I was concerned about him being out alone. Smiling, I asked him to wait while I grabbed some candy. I returned with a handful, filled his bag, and glanced around for his parents or friends, but there was no one in sight. The boy turned and started walking away, and I lingered in the doorway, watching to make sure he was safe. Seeing no one, I went back inside, locked the door, and returned to my movie. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang again. I grabbed the candy bag and opened the door to find the same boy, but this time, he wasn't holding his candy bag. I asked if he was okay, but he didn't answer. Glancing around, I noticed a man standing across the street, watching us. He looked like an adult and was also dressed in a strange, black and red costume, similar to the boys. "Is that your dad?" I asked. After a moment's hesitation, the boy nodded. When I asked why he'd come back, he said he wanted more candy. This confused me, especially since he didn't have his bag. I offered him some candy from my own bag, but he seemed oddly dissatisfied, reaching in reluctantly and taking only one piece before running back toward the man across the street. The whole situation left me uneasy, so I locked the door and returned to the couch to finish my movie. The movie ended around midnight, and as I prepared to head to bed, I noticed a flash of light by my garage window. Nervous, I went to check it out and realized the motion sensor lights had triggered. I watched for a while but saw nothing, so I closed the blinds and went upstairs to bed. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off and lay there, tossing and turning. Just as I was drifting off, a soft sound startled me, followed by loud knocking on my front door. My heart pounded as I crept downstairs. Right as I approached the door, 3 sharp bangs made me jump back. Taking a breath, I finally looked through the peephole and saw the man from earlier, the boy's father, standing just inches from my door in his unsettling costume and mask. I thought he was holding something, but he was too close for me to tell what it was. A cold realization hit me: I couldn't open the door. I had no idea what he wanted or who he even was. Panicking, I dashed upstairs, grabbed my phone, and locked myself in my room, calling 911 as fear gripped me. The man continued pounding on the door, but after a few minutes, it went quiet. I waited, listening for what felt like hours, before cautiously looking out my bedroom window. Then I heard the crash of breaking glass from the kitchen. Terror washed over me. I had no weapon to defend myself, so I locked my bedroom door and grabbed the lamp from my bedside, preparing to defend myself if I had to. Luckily, it didn't come to that. Soon, I heard police sirens outside and hurried footsteps in the hallway near the kitchen. The sounds of shuffling indicated the man had likely fled through the broken kitchen window. I stayed put until a police officer knocked on my bedroom door, and I finally felt safe enough to come down. They checked the house to make sure he was gone, confirming that he'd broken in through the kitchen window. I stayed at a hotel for a couple of nights afterward, trying to calm my nerves. Though he hadn't taken anything, I kept wondering if he'd used his son as bait to gain access to my house. His motives remain a mystery. Now, almost a year later, Halloween is around the corner again, and I can't shake the paranoia that he might return to finish what he started. I remember that October 31st vividly. It feels like it happened just yesterday. My parents had dragged me out to a remote property because they were thinking about buying a farm. I was completely against the idea. There was nothing there but empty fields, a dilapidated barn, and a house that looked ready to collapse. The only saving grace was that I'd brought my drone along, figuring it might keep me entertained if things got as boring as I expected. However, with the dry, bland landscape around us, I didn't anticipate capturing anything interesting. While my parents were busy with the real estate agent in the main house, I thought it was a perfect time to take the drone out for a spin and see if there was anything remotely noteworthy to explore. I sent it up, surveying the landscape, and soon directed it toward a cornfield in the distance. The view from above was more intriguing than I'd expected, but as I flew over the cornfield, something strange popped up on the screen, a figure that sent a chill down my spine. Standing there, among the corn, was a mime. His face was painted white, his lips were painted red, and he wore a classic black and white striped shirt under a black suit with a black tie. He stood absolutely still, staring directly at the drone's camera. My heart skipped a beat. Why would a mime be out here, in the middle of nowhere? Mimes perform in crowded areas, not empty farmlands with nothing but fields and dusty roads in every direction. At first, I thought maybe it was a prank set up by the agent. But as I zoomed in for a closer look, the mime suddenly turned and ran toward the woods bordering the field. Stunned, I watched him disappear, wondering what on earth I had just seen. It didn't make sense. Just as I was about to bring the drone back, I noticed its battery was running low. I looked back at the screen, and to my horror, the mime was no longer heading for the woods. He was now running straight toward the drone, toward me. Panic washed over me. I tried to stay calm, even as every instinct screamed at me to run. But I knew if I abandoned the drone, I'd have to go retrieve it from the field. So, gathering all my focus, I guided it back down to where I was standing. Every second felt stretched, and I was poised to bolt, but I stayed put. As I lowered the drone, I looked up and saw that the mime had come closer than I'd realized. The air was thick with tension, and he stood at the edge of the woods, watching me with unsettling eyes. Clutching my drone, I forced myself to walk toward the barn, trying to appear calm and act as though nothing unusual had happened. My mind raced, yet I knew that running would only make things worse. I felt entirely alone, my parents had no idea what was happening. The thought of going back to the main house terrified me, thinking he might follow me. So instead, I slipped into the barn, hiding under an old wooden table. From my spot, I could see the barn door without being seen. My heart hammered as I watched the entrance. To my horror, the mime had followed me. He stood in the doorway, casually looking down at his phone, as if waiting for something. For a moment, I thought he might leave, but then more figures appeared. One by one, mimes began gathering outside the barn. I counted 6 in total, all with unsettling expressions. They pointed silently at the door, communicating with eerie gestures. I was trapped. If I ran, they'd catch me, but if I stayed, they'd eventually find me. I watched, heart pounding, as the mime with the phone finally entered the barn, followed by the others in a grim procession, like something out of a horror movie. As they spread out to search, one came dangerously close to my hiding spot. I held my breath, trying not to make a sound. But when one mime leaned down toward the table, I panicked and bolted, running as fast as I could. In an instant, they were after me. I dodged a few, but one caught my shirt and yanked me down, slamming me against the dirt floor. The impact left me gasping, but I scrambled to my feet, knowing I had no time to waste. But I wasn't fast enough. Before I could escape, they surrounded me. I couldn't tell how many there were or where they came from, but they closed in, raining blows on me. I curled up, trying to shield my face, but they hit me hard, targeting my ribs, stomach, and legs. Every part of me hurt. Just then, I heard my dad's voice from outside the barn. The mimes paused, exchanging silent gestures. I barely had the strength to sit up, but my dad entered the barn, only to be attacked himself. The sight of my father being beaten was worse than anything I'd experienced. He fought back, but he was outnumbered. Just when I thought all hope was lost, a shout echoed from outside. The farm's owner appeared with a shotgun, yelling that he'd called the police. At his warning, the mimes hesitated, retreating. But one lingered, furious that the game was ending. He grabbed a heavy metal plate, intent on using it against me. He approached slowly, a twisted grin on his face, lifting the metal high. Just as he was about to strike, the owner aimed the shotgun at him, threatening to pull the trigger if he didn't back off. Another mime, perhaps the sanest of them, shouted, "Brad, what are you doing? Do you want us all to go down for this?" Reluctantly, the one with the plate dropped it, and the group took off. Soon after, the police and paramedics arrived, capturing 2 of the 6 mimes, including the one who had nearly killed me. Both my father and I were taken to the hospital. We were alive, but barely. The mime who tried to kill me was eventually convicted of attempted murder, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the punishment didn't fit the horror they'd put us through. Still, I remembered the words of the one who had intervened. Without him, things might have ended much worse. The scars of that night remain, though knowing some of them faced justice brings a small measure of relief. I never discovered who those mimes were or what they truly wanted, but at least, for now, a few of them are behind bars. I'm just an average guy with a wife and 2 little girls, my world. I lead a simple life, working a routine job at the post office. But what I'm about to share is anything but ordinary. You might not believe me, I wouldn't blame you if you didn't. But here's what my family went through. It began when we moved into the old family house that once belonged to my parents. My mom had recently passed, and the house had been empty for a while. We thought that living there with our daughters would honor her memory and fill the place with new life. What we didn't expect was that we wouldn't be alone. At first, there were just odd noises. The girls said they saw shadows moving around the house at night, doors would open and close by themselves, and sometimes the doorbell would ring when no one was there. I brushed it off, thinking maybe it was all in their heads. After all, they'd never been in a house this big before. But gradually, I started noticing things myself, doors swinging shut with no wind, rooms feeling icy even in the middle of summer. It was unsettling, but I stayed because, deep down, I thought maybe it was my mom's spirit lingering. At first, it scared me, but then I began to hear a soft humming, the same lullaby she used to sing to me as a child. I tried to reassure my family, explaining away the strange events, but they weren't convinced. Then, things took a darker turn. Objects began flying across the room, narrowly missing us. My daughters often felt watched, and I sensed something ominous building. I started wondering if my mom's spirit was trying to warn us or if something else had taken residence in the house. To get answers, we decided to try contacting her on Halloween, the night when spirits are thought to be most active. By then, the strange occurrences were undeniable, and I finally admitted to my family that I believed something supernatural was going on. My wife suggested we try a seance. We bought a Ouija board, and on Halloween night, after the girls went to a friend's house to celebrate, my wife, my brother Adam, who thought it'd just be a bit of spooky fun, and I gathered in the house. At first, it was light-hearted. We asked simple questions. Was anyone here with us? Was this presence my mother? But when we asked if the spirit was indeed my mother, the answer was a stark no. The air grew thick with tension, and Adam went pale. This isn't right. It's not her, is it? He whispered. Can we reach her? He asked, his voice shaky. But I felt like we should stop. Before I could finish suggesting we end it, the planchette started to tremble violently, as if someone had flung it toward me. Chaos erupted. Adam cried out in panic, "Let's get out of here." We all rushed to the door as the house began to shake, pictures falling off the walls as though the house itself was furious. We made it outside and headed for the car, but something made me pause. I heard it, the faint, familiar tune of my mother's humming floating through the air. "Wait, Adam." I called, "I have to check. Maybe it's her." It sounded absurd, even to me, but I needed to know. I ignored their shouts for me to stay and went back inside, following the sound. As I entered the kitchen, the light flickered, and there, in the dimness, stood a figure. It looked like my mother. She stopped humming and took a step forward. I was about to run to her, but something stopped me. My body felt paralyzed, my instincts warning me. I stood there, frozen, as reality settled in. This wasn't my mother. Choking back tears, I stumbled back out of the house and into the car where my wife waited. As we pulled away, I glanced back one last time. There, at the window, was my mother, or something that looked like her, waving, her smile disturbingly twisted, her face quivering unnaturally. Months passed after that horrific night. My brother took us in, and we saved up just enough to move somewhere else. We couldn't sell the house, not wanting anyone else to experience what we had. Now, all I want is to enjoy life with my wife and daughters, the way my mother would have wanted. As I watch my daughters laugh and play, I feel her love alive in my memories, even if she's gone. My name is Nathan. I grew up in a small town in the southern part of the country with my dad and younger sister, Ollie. We lost our mom when we were too young to understand what death meant, so Dad raised us with all his love and dedication. Ollie was always quiet and shy, the opposite of my outgoing personality, and struggled to make friends. From a young age, I knew I had to be her support and offer her the extra love she needed. She often stood in front of the mirror, asking me or Dad how she looked, and we'd always tell her she was beautiful, no matter what. Her cheeks would light up with our compliments, and that filled us with joy. Ollie and I went to the same school, and all my friends and the neighborhood kids knew her. Some of them teased her, saying she was strange, and I still remember getting into my first fight defending her. That night, Ollie cried a lot and, for the first time, told us she missed Mom. Our dad, who had loved Mom deeply, never remarried. My aunt had tried setting him up with a friend, but he refused, thinking no one could ever love us like she did. Dad sacrificed a lot to give us a happy childhood, and the people in our town loved us. That October, I was excited for Halloween. I was 6, and Ollie was 4, nervous for her first time trick-or-treating. We decorated the porch with carved pumpkins, and Dad got us everything we needed for Halloween. My best friend and I were on the porch, sipping lemonade and watching neighbors prepare for the night. Kids ran around in excitement, and laughter filled the street as people decorated. Suddenly, I heard Ali's voice coming from her bedroom. Her window was right by the porch, and with Dad out shopping, I was the adult in charge. I went to see who she was talking to, but when I peeked in, I only saw her sitting on her bed with her teddy bear, facing the closed door. "Who are you talking to?" I asked. She quickly looked away and said, "No one." Relieved, I told her we were on the porch if she needed anything. That evening, we sat down to dinner, chatting about Halloween costumes. Out of nowhere, Ollie began humming a strange tune I'd never heard before. She was sitting on the porch braiding her doll's hair, completely unaware that we were listening. I glanced at Dad, shocked to see him go pale. He stopped cooking and asked, "Ollie, who taught you that song?" She looked confused and asked, "What song?" When Dad pressed her, she simply said she hadn't been singing anything, her innocent response leaving us both puzzled. I asked Dad what was going on, but he just brushed it off, saying it was time to eat. We dropped the subject, though it stayed on my mind. Around midnight, I woke up to Ali's laughter coming from her room. Curious, I tiptoed over to remind her it was bedtime. But as I opened her door, her lampshade suddenly fell to the floor with a soft thud. In the dim light, I saw the lampshade floating in midair. Ali's laughter echoed around the room as I asked, "What's going on? How is it floating?" She just lay back on her bed, eyes closed as if nothing unusual was happening. A chill ran down my spine. The next morning, I told Dad about it, and though he tried to stay calm, I could tell he was worried. But luckily, Halloween Day distracted us. The neighborhood buzzed with excitement as kids dressed up and went door to door, shouting, "Trick or treat." I was dressed as Superman, and Ollie wore a Tinkerbell costume. My friends joined us as we roamed the streets, buckets filling with candy. Despite my lingering unease about Ali's room, I pushed the thoughts aside, eager to enjoy the night. We wandered farther than usual, led by a friend who suggested we explore the outskirts of the neighborhood. Although Dad had warned me to stay close to Ollie, the thrill of the night made me feel invincible. We soon found ourselves near an old, empty house. Despite its abandoned appearance, a huge pumpkin with a lit candle sat on the porch, casting an eerie glow. "Let's check it out," one of my friends said. While Mike and I hesitated, we all eventually moved closer. But when I looked back, Ollie had stopped, fear in her eyes. She pleaded for us to turn back, saying she had a bad feeling. I reassured her, asking her to wait by the stairs as we knocked on the door. After a few unanswered knocks, Mike, frustrated, kicked the door open, and it creaked as it swung inward, revealing a musty, dark hallway. "Hello." I called out, but the silence lingered until a soft, low voice from the darkness said, "Come in." I was about to take a step when Ollie ran up to me, clinging to my hand. "Can't you see? She wants to hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "Who?" I asked, alarmed. She replied with a warning that made my skin crawl, "It's the mommy with the blue face." A shiver ran through us. Hearing that, Mike and my other friend bolted without a second thought. I froze, holding Ollie close as the woman's voice called out again, her tone angry, "Ollie, bring him in." Ollie's voice shook as she cried out, "You're not my mommy." When we finally got home, Ollie burst into tears, and Dad looked at me, a worried expression crossing his face. "I lied to you," she said, tearfully. "That blue-faced mommy taught me that song. I don't like her anymore. She wants you and Nathan dead." I could see fear in Dad's face as he stammered, "What does she look like?" Ollie replied, "Her face is blue, and she has no eyelids." Her description was terrifying, and I understood why dread filled the room. That night, we all slept together in Ali's room, but in the middle of the night, I heard Dad's voice, desperate and shaky, shouting, "Leave my family alone." It was a chilling experience, and that Halloween was the last time Ollie ever mentioned the blue-faced mommy. I'm still not sure if any of it was real or just our imaginations, and honestly, I don't want to know. But I'm certain that whatever was in that house wasn't something meant to be a part of our Halloween night.